Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We have Macedonian battle tactics by Historia Civilis. We're going to skip like 45 seconds to a minute into the video just because the first minute really doesn't even have sound. Might just be due to copyright, YouTube copywriting the first minute, so it muted it. Nevertheless, we're going to keep going from here. We're not going to waste this video. We're going to jump right in, and the sound should pick up very soon. Glad you're here. Hit the like button. Let's go.
The Macedonians called their cavalry the companions, or the companion cavalry. During this period, most Western armies had a really narrow conception of the proper use of cavalry. Many trained them to harass the enemy by throwing javelins or shooting arrows. Others used them as scouts or skirmishers, but beyond that, their use was limited. The Macedonians ignored this conventional wisdom. The companion cavalry specialized in charging the enemy flanks and inflicting massive casualties up close with their swords and spears.
Did the Macedonian cavalry revolutionize cavalry? Because we see that all the time in like the Roman usage of cavalry, and we just watched like a Carthaginian cavalry from Hannibal do similar things. I'm wondering. Let me know.
Despite what the movies may tell you, this was rare in the ancient world. You could even say that it was unintuitive. Stirrups hadn't been invented yet, and many people, including the Macedonians, didn't even use saddles. A person could get knocked off their horse by a stiff breeze. To many, charging straight into a mass of humanity seemed suicidal. But the Macedonians knew what they were doing. For instance, the spears they used were quite interesting. They were made to be as light and as thin as possible, so thin that the wooden spear wobbled as they charged. They were about 12 feet long and were held near the center.
12 feet long is insane.
Both ends of the spear had metal tips, so if one end broke, all the rider had to do was flip the spear around and continue fighting with the other end.
Wow.
If that end broke as well, they had a sword to use as backup. Obviously, these spears weren't designed to crash into the enemy line. That would have shattered the spear and knocked the rider off the horse. The spear was designed to make lightning-quick stabs while on the move. This was hard to do, but the companions were expertly trained and were quite deadly with them. So all of this made the companions pretty distinct in the ancient world, but they also organized themselves in a strange way. When they charged, they didn't do it in a line like you'd think. They charged as a wedge. There's a reason for this. When cavalry charges in a line, they have a tendency to do this. When the Macedonian wedges charged, they could do this. Here's why. The person at the tip of the wedge was the guy in charge. Since everyone could keep an eye on their leader, the entire unit could
So the direction is more accurate.
basically receive orders non-verbally. This meant that they could wordlessly change directions mid-gallop, or specifically target vulnerable enemy units with surgical accuracy. When they made contact with the enemy, any opening made by the riders at the front could immediately be exploited by the riders further back. As a result, the wedges were capable of creating chaos and cutting deep into the enemy line. A well-timed charge like this could single-handedly win a battle.
Wow.
But no matter how successful the cavalry were, the opportunities they created needed to be followed up by infantry. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For this to make sense, we need a rock-solid understanding of what a phalanx was. If we're talking phalanxes, we're talking spears. Dudes holding spears maybe 8 feet long, with big circular shields. A phalanx was a group of these spearmen organized into a tight square. In battle, they presented a solid shield wall, bristling with spears. Since there were so many people packed into the square, and everybody in the square was so well trained, the phalanxes had an intense forward momentum. Against less disciplined opponents, they were nearly unstoppable. But they had
Like a human tank meat shield.
vulnerabilities. They were slow as hell, both slow to move and slow to turn. Plus, since the entire phalanx had to work together, they were pretty bad at fighting in two directions at once. This made them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. When two opposing phalanxes met on the battlefield, the two squares would lock shields and push against each other as hard as they could. This would basically take both of the phalanxes out of commission for a while, and the shoving would continue until one side lost their footing, or another group showed up to tip the balance. Phalanxes were all the rage in Greece. For the century or two preceding Philip's reign, the entire peninsula was basically going through one giant phalanx arms race. For the longest time, Macedon didn't have phalanxes. The Macedonians were able to survive on the strength of their excellent cavalry, but the infantry side of things was kind of ignored. When Philip came to power, he busied himself with a bunch of reforms and introduced phalanxes to Macedon. He gave these new units a new prestigious name, the Foot Companions.
Okay.
Through Philip's leadership, they would become the backbone of the Macedonian army. The Foot Companions were modeled after the Greek phalanx, but were new and improved. They used a new kind of spear called the sarissa. Technically, sarissas might be pikes rather than spears, but whatever, let's not be sticklers to detail. This weapon was usually 14 or 18 or sometimes even 20 feet long.
How are you gonna hold something 20 feet long?
It was basically twice as long as the spears they used in Greece. So what did this mean?
I mean, it's like a fighter. Like if you watch the UFC or boxing, your arm length is everything, because that means you can inflict damage further away than your opponent is to you. So like if you're, this is you and this is me, and this is my middle finger, this is my pointing finger. My middle finger is slightly bigger or longer. So it's going to be further. You guys aren't stupid. You know what I mean? This is a huge advantage, but I guess they have to like proportion the weight in a certain way for the spear to actually be manageable.
Well, if you can picture two phalanxes marching at each other, the one with the longer spears would always draw first blood, and would therefore have the advantage. Plus, the sarissas were so long that people 3 or 4 or 5 rows back could still reach the enemy with their spears.
Wow.
If you compare this with the Greek phalanx, the Macedonians were able to get double or triple the number of spears attacking at once, with no additional manpower. But the sarissas came with a downside. They were absurdly long, and it took an equally absurd amount of training to be able to use them effectively.
I bet.
Unlike normal spears, the sarissas had to be held with both hands. To accommodate this, the Macedonians shrunk down their shields and made them into tiny 18-inch bucklers, which could be strapped to each man's upper arm and used to deflect incoming spears. To get the untrained Macedonian infantry comfortable with this new weapon, they had to be drilled and drilled and drilled at a huge cost. But in the end, it was worth it. Once they were in the field, the Foot Companions were basically elite phalanxes, better trained and better equipped than their Greek counterparts. But all of the training in the world couldn't change the fact that it was incredibly hard for all phalanxes, including these new Foot Companions, to respond quickly to a changing battlefield. They still had all of the weaknesses of a normal phalanx. They were still slow, and still vulnerable to getting flanked. When a bunch of phalanxes were lined up, the units at each end of the line were exposed. Here, Philip placed a new kind of infantry, called the shield bearers.
The shield bearers.
The shield bearers were outfitted in a much more traditional Greek style, with a shorter, more manageable spear and a large shield. They also carried swords. Since they weren't weighed down with the giant unwieldy sarissa, the shield bearers were much more versatile than the Foot Companions.
So I'm guessing they were specifically used for like defense.
They were the Macedonian army's utility players. They could fight as a regular phalanx, or they could spread out. They could quickly redeploy on the battlefield, or totally break formation and charge. They could fight with a spear or with a sword. If you ever hear about the Macedonians doing anything weird, like fighting on uneven ground, or breaching walls, or scaling cliffs, it was the shield bearers who did it. These units were entirely made up of veteran soldiers, men with long and distinguished careers, plucked from the foot companions and given a place of honor on the flanks.
Wow.
Under normal circumstances, these units were supposed to hold back and leave the intense fighting to the foot companions. The shield bearers were kind of like a reserve force, except Philip's innovation was to put his reserves on the exposed flanks, which is kinda genius. When the enemy line began to falter, the shield bearers were sent in. They could move much faster than the foot companions, and their looser way of fighting was better for dealing with a retreating enemy. Now all of the pieces are in place. Let's see how they worked together. The most well-known Macedonian tactic is called the hammer and anvil.
See, I don't even know. So this is good information.
You may have heard of this.
No.
It's super famous.
Sorry.
With the hammer and anvil, it was the infantry's job, in this case the foot companions, to engage the enemy and hold them in place. They were the anvil. It was the cavalry's job to swing around and attack the enemy from behind.
Hammer.
They were the hammer. The whole thing relied on the speed and effectiveness of the hammer, and the reliability of the anvil.
Split.
The whole point of this tactic was to quickly envelop the enemy, and force them to face attacks from two directions at once. If the enemy wanted to break the encirclement, they either had to go through the foot companions, who were basically one giant unstoppable meat grinder, or go through the companion cavalry, who happened to be one of the most effective cavalry units in human history.
So this is no surprise that the Macedonians were able to conquer the entire known world at this point.
Simple, but it's extremely effective. Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae used this tactic against the Romans with astounding success, but we'll cover other famous examples in the near future. Before Philip's reign, Macedon did not have reliable infantry. They were able to get by because of their excellent cavalry, but nobody ever bothered to invest the time and money to bring the infantry up to the Greek standard. Philip changed this. Through his leadership, he not only met the Greek standard, but exceeded it. At the time of his death, Macedon was still a regional power, but thanks to Philip, it could now field a world-class army.
Very true. Wow. Great video. Understanding kind of like the complexity of the military of the Macedons. Anvil and hammer, that's a thing that I'm going to be looking at, especially we're doing another series with Hannibal in the Second Punic War. So when we get to the Battle of Cannae, that will also be a very important point to look for, how that is done. But thank you guys so much for watching. This is just one of the many episodes that we're going to be doing for Historia Civilis on the Alexander side. I think we have 3 more to go based off the playlist I was looking at. So 3 more videos after this that will probably show some of the campaigns and some of the battles. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave some video suggestions down below if you're into the Macedonian side. And yeah, peace out. Bye.